Good evening. This is Pastor Dan. Thanks for joining us tonight for our continued study in the book of Acts and the series Acts Expanded. And this evening, I want to talk to you about something I can't remember if I mentioned specifically or not this morning, but in Acts chapter 20, verses 5 and 6, we see something very interesting happen. If you have your Bibles there with you, please open it up to that passage. So, Acts chapter 20, we're going to look just briefly at two verses here. And I just want you to know, notice just a few words here. So, Acts 20, verse 5 and verse 6 says this: These men, and that refers to the men of verse 4, going ahead, waited for us. I want you to notice the word us, waited for us at Troas, verse 6. But we, notice the word but we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and then in 5 days joined them at Troas, where we stayed 7 days. So the three words I emphasized there were the words us, and then 2 times the word we. Now, if we're reading this and paying attention, what do these 3 words tell us in relation to Luke and Paul? Well, it tells us that Luke was with Paul at these 2 places. And this is an example. What we have here in this passage is an example of what we call the we passages of the book of Acts. And the we passages in the book of Acts are simply those passages where Luke is with Paul, where he's an actual traveling companion or a ministry companion with Paul. And so I want to look at those this evening. So in the book of Acts, we have these passages that we call the we passages. These passages are when Luke includes himself with the group of men who are with Paul, or just he himself with Paul at any one time. We see this in several places, but we see this most particularly from our text this morning here in Acts 20, verses 5 through 6. And so I want us to consider these we passages, and I want us to do so from 2 perspectives. Scriptural, with the words, the text itself, and geographical. How do these we passages relate to geography? How do they connect to the different aspects of geography? You'll remember in the book of Acts, it's really important to have your Bible geography down so you can know how Paul traveled, where he traveled, and that type of thing. So I want to take these 2 perspectives. So let's take the scriptural perspective first, the scriptural perspective. And this just deals, where do we find these in the book of Acts as far as in the flow of the context of the book of Acts. So here's some things we need to think about. First, these passages are about Luke being with Acts. So that's the type of thing we're looking for. Luke being with Acts, where Luke includes himself. Did I say Luke being with Acts? Luke being with Paul. When Luke includes himself with Paul by using words such as we or us. In other words, he is using what we call the first person plural pronoun, we and us. So it's first person, we, us, plural. Us is third person, excuse me. But so he's using the we and us here, the plural pronouns. And when we consider the book of Acts, we find that the word we, at least in our English Bible, appears some 135 times. That might sound like a lot, but it's actually not that many times when you consider how common the word we appears, or even how we use the word we. 75 of these occurrences. So of the 135 times we appears in Acts, 75 of these times it either doesn't relate to Paul, doesn't deal with Paul. In other words, it's in those passages, say in the first part of the book of Acts, where Paul's not even present. So it doesn't have anything to do with Paul. Or it's found in the dialogues that Paul has with other people. And so in that case, Paul is using the word we, not Luke. Luke isn't writing we, including himself. Paul is using the word we. And so this leaves us about 60 occurrences where we relates to Luke and Paul's relationship here in the book of Acts, where we see Luke is with Paul. Now, of these 60 occurrences, they're found in 5 passages. Okay, they're found in 5 passages. So these are what we call the 5 we passages. Chapter 16, verses 10 through 16. 6 times we have the plural pronoun there. First person plural pronoun. In chapter 20, verses 6 through 15, actually you could probably say verse 5 because we have us in verse 5. But up through verse 15, 7 times it appears here. So that's quite a bit. Third passage is in chapter 21, verses 1 through 17, 22 times. That's a lot. That's a big focus on Luke being with Paul. Fourthly, in chapter 27, verses 1 through 37, 19 times. And then in chapter 28, verses 10 through 16, 8 times. So we have these 5 passages where we find what we call the we passages, the we verses. Now, these 5 passages can be divided into 3 groups of time, 3 time periods. So chapter 16 is its own time period. And of course, if you remember what's happening in chapter 16, we have the Macedonian call, where Paul has moved from the region of Galatia, and he's tried to go to Asia, and the Spirit doesn't let him, so he tries to go to Bithynia. Spirit doesn't let him, so he goes to Troas, and it is in Troas where we have the first time that Luke uses the word we, referring to himself being with Paul. So we have that time. Then we have chapters 20 through 21. And of course, in chapter 20, or actually chapter 19, Paul is in Ephesus. Then in chapter 20, he starts to travel. And so he's traveling in chapter 20, and he makes his way to different places, including Philippi, Troas, several other places, ending up in Miletus. That's where he ends up in chapter 20. And then he's headed towards Jerusalem, and he gets all the way to Jerusalem in chapter 21. So that's all connected time-wise. This is just a smooth flow of events in chapter 20 and 21. Then the third and final time period is chapters 27 and 28. And these 2 chapters contain Paul's voyage to Rome. And finally in 28, he is in Rome. So it occurs those time periods. Now, you'll notice that there's some pretty significant gaps that can be seen here. Especially between chapter 21 and 27, there's this huge gap. But let me tell you that most of that gap is filled up with Paul's dialogues with other people, and it seems very likely that Luke is with Paul from chapter 20 on until the end of the book. And so that's the scriptural indication. And let me give you the verses here. I just want to bring this slide up so as you go back through here, you can stop this recording, take a screenshot of it, take a picture of it, and you'll have these verses. So chapter 16, you see the verses where we appears. Chapter 20, chapter 21, 27, and 28. So I'm going to leave that up there just a little bit so you can see that. Again, hit the pause button if you need to write this down or take a picture of it with your phone, or if you know how to take a screenshot with your computer or with your phone, go ahead and do that, and then you'll have these verses handy for your notes. Now I want to move on to the geographical considerations. That we just covered the scriptural considerations. Now let's talk about geography. I like geography. I like maps. I like studying maps. I know not everybody does that, but in the book of Acts, understanding our geography is important. And the first thing we see is in chapter 16, which we know there's wee passages there. We see that the geography here is Troas and Philippi. And of course, this is going to be pretty close to the beginning of Paul's second ministry trip, where he's going back to visit the churches that he planted on the first ministry trip. So in chapter 16, verses 8 through 10, we see that Luke joins Paul at Troas. Notice what it says in chapter 16, verse 8. It says, "So passing by Mysia, they came down to Troas." Now, who is the they there? Well, the they refers to Paul and Silas and Timothy, back at the first part of chapter 16. So it's at least those, but the they also tells us Luke is not with Paul in verse 8. So passing by Mysia on their way, and they're going through Mysia, they came down to Troas. So as they're traveling from Mysia to Troas, Luke is not with them. Verse 9. "And a vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man of Macedonia stood and pleaded with him, saying, 'Come over to Macedonia and help us.'" Now look at verse 10. "Now after he had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go to Macedonia." You see that difference? In verse 8, it was they, but in verse 10, it is we. Luke includes himself now with Paul. And at the end of the verse, it says, "concluding that the Lord had called us." Again, Luke including himself in there, to preach the gospel to them. And so what we conclude from this is that Luke joins his group at Troas on his second ministry trip. Now, also in chapter 16 and verse 11, we see that Luke is with Paul at Philippi. Verse 11, "Therefore, sailing from Troas, we ran a straight course to Samothrace, and the next day came to Neapolis." So notice it says, "we ran a straight course." So Luke is with Paul. Verse 12, it says from there to Philippi. Yeah, you remember Neapolis was the port city for Philippi. Philippi was a little bit farther inland. But the point is, Luke is with Paul at this point. Then if we look a little bit farther ahead in chapter 16, and we come to verse 40, and then we'll move to chapter 17, verse 1, we see that Luke is no longer with Paul. So notice what it says in chapter 16, verse 40. It says, "So they went out of the prison." This was talking about Paul and Silas in the prison in Philippi. "So they went out of the prison and entered the house of Lydia. And when they had seen the brethren, they encouraged them and departed." Chapter 17, verse 1. "Now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews." So Luke is no longer with Paul. Now, if he's no longer with Paul here at the end of chapter 16 and the beginning of chapter 17, it seems to me that we can conclude, at least tentatively conclude, that it is possible that Luke stays at Philippi, or he just stays in that general vicinity, but he doesn't go on with Paul. He's no longer with Paul. And so We see that in chapter 16, Luke joins Paul, but then at the end of chapter 16, in the beginning of chapter 17, Luke is no longer with Paul. And so they are in Troas together and then in Philippi together. Now let's consider chapters 20 and 21. That's our third time period, and we see the key geographical locations. There's a lot more geography listed in this particular passage than the others, but these are the three key places: Philippi, Troas, and Miletus. Now, we've already looked at this, but notice again in chapter 20, verse 6, it says, we sailed from Philippi. We sailed from Philippi. Now, what does that mean? That means that Luke and Paul were in Philippi together. Now, that's exactly where we saw Luke and Paul together the last time. That's the last time they were together, was in Philippi. So chapter 16, Luke and Paul were in Philippi. Then we have some things happen in between, and we come to chapter 20, and we have Luke and Paul back in Philippi again. It doesn't appear that they were together at all between chapter 16 and chapter 20, but here they are at Philippi again. And so again, this makes us think, or at least suppose, that Luke remained in Philippi while Paul was continuing on his second ministry trip and started his third ministry trip. And so we have Paul and Luke in Philippi in chapter 20, verse 6. Now look at chapter 20, verses 13 and 14. Then we went ahead to the ship and sailed to Assos, there intending to take Paul on board. For so he had given orders, intending himself to go on foot. And when he met us at Assos, we took him on board and came to Miletus. Now, in this travel that they're doing, remember, Paul intends to go to Jerusalem. We learned that last week in our Sunday morning service. He intends to go to Jerusalem, but somewhere along the way, he says, I'm going to walk you off sail. I'm going to walk around. Maybe he didn't have his sea legs. Maybe he got seasick. Who knows? Maybe he just wanted to talk to somebody. But he's going to walk. But Luke is including himself with the companions of Paul. So Luke and Paul are going from Troas to Miletus, and they get him on board in Miletus. Verse 15 says, we sailed from there. So again, we sailed from there. Now, if we flip over to chapter 21, we see Luke and Paul departing Miletus. Now, while Luke and Paul were at Miletus, this is where Paul speaks to the Ephesian elders, the elders of the Ephesian church. So the leaders of the Ephesian church came to Paul in Miletus. Paul didn't want to go there. He didn't want to get distracted by going to Ephesus. He was headed to Jerusalem, and he was trying to make sure nothing got in his way. And so he didn't go to Ephesus. The elders came to him. But in chapter 21, verse 1, we see that Luke and Paul are departing Ephesus. It says, now it came to pass that when we had departed from them and set sail, running a straight course, we came to Kos, the following day to Rhodes, and from there to Patara. And so again, Luke and Paul are together traveling as they leave Miletus. Now we want to take a look at chapter 21, verse 17. Chapter 21, verse 17. And we see that Luke and Paul arrive in Jerusalem. 17 says, and when we had come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. So again, Paul and Luke in Jerusalem. There's probably more than just Paul and Luke in this group, but the emphasis here is that Luke is included in the group that is with Paul. So now they're in Jerusalem. So Luke has been with Paul from being in Philippi at the beginning of chapter 20, all the way in his travels till he comes to Jerusalem. Now, sticking with chapter 21, from verse 18, on through chapter 23, verse 31. So that's a pretty big chunk. We don't have any we passages at all. And what we see happening here is that Paul is talking to the Jews in Rome. He's going to the temple. Luke is not included in any of this. Undoubtedly, in my opinion, Luke is there, but nothing's happening where Luke needs to mention that he is there with Paul. The focus is totally upon Paul himself and what's happening to Paul and how he gets arrested, and there's a plot against him, and he finally gets sent to Felix. So we see all that happen. Now, in verses 23, or chapter 23, verse 32, through chapter 26, verse 32, they move Paul from Jerusalem to Caesarea Maritima. So this is on the Mediterranean Sea. He's in Roman custody. And the reason that he's in Roman custody is because he had declared his Roman citizenship and said, I can appeal to Caesar. And so this is what's happening. He's in this custody there. And while he's in custody in Caesarea, he talks to Felix, Agrippa, and Festus while he's there. And so this is a huge section of dialogue between these different people, but there's no mention of the we passages because Luke's not mentioned there. And we don't come back to Luke again until we get to chapter 27, verse 1. Notice what it says in chapter 27, verse 1. And when it was decided that we should set sail, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment. And so when Luke says, or when he writes, and when it was decided that we should set sail, that is letting us know, that is indicating to us that Luke was already with Paul in Caesarea. Now, we don't know when he joined Paul or how long he's been with Paul at Caesarea. I am of the opinion that probably what happened is when when Paul was taken into custody, that the Romans didn't let Luke be with him. And so when they transferred the custody from Jerusalem to Caesarea, they would have taken him by army escort. And I think Luke probably just tagged along. He went along with them. They would have been traveling on the main road. He could have followed along, and he just followed him there. And so he was in the same area as Paul, and so when Paul's getting ready to go to Rome, he just joins in and he can go with them. Remember, Paul is being treated as a Roman citizen during this time and not just a common criminal by any sort. And then we come to chapter 28, verse 16, and this is the last occurrence that we have of the we passages. Chapter 28, verse 16, it says, Now when we came to Rome, did you get that? Now, when we came to Rome, so Luke is with Paul in Rome, the centurion, that's Julius, we already mentioned him, the centurion delivered the prisoners to the captain of the guard, but Paul was permitted to dwell by himself with a soldier who guarded him. And so Paul is in Rome, and Luke is in Rome with Paul. He arrives with Paul at Rome. And as far as we know, Luke stayed with him in Rome. Now, the point I want to emphasize here is that from these we passages, we know that Luke spent an extended time with Paul. And that it seems that the only time he was separated from Paul in the passages from chapter 20 to chapter 28 is a short time that Paul was in custody at Caesarea. There was some time in there that he was separated from Paul, but the rest of the time he is with Paul. And so this means that when we look at the events that take place, especially at the end of the book of Acts, Luke isn't giving us a third party or third hand, fourth hand, or fifth hand account. He's not looking it up in a history book. He was an eyewitness to the things that happened. And so that gives us a little bit more information about how Luke knew all these things. Furthermore, it also lets us know that Luke would have been a good source of the teachings of Paul. They spent a tremendous amount of time together, not only in ministry, but just in life in general. They would have been spending a tremendous amount of time together, and certainly they would have had conversations about all sorts of things. So, as we conclude, remember, Luke spends an extended period of time with Paul. There only seems to be a short period of time where Luke is separated from Paul at the end of the book of Acts. Luke is an eyewitness of the events in these last 8 chapters. Well, I hope this helps you as we are studying the book of Acts, and hopefully it shows you a little bit more about Luke and about Luke's relationship to Paul and how he knew about all these things and can give us such a detailed account, even the names of the centurion. I mean, think about it. He even gives you the name of the centurion there. Firsthand eyewitness. Well, I pray that the Lord bless you as you continue to live for him.